brutal dictator, and it's entirely up to him, to one man, his mood, and if he feels humiliated or if he feels that he's losing the war in Ukraine, he could indeed resort to these horrific weapons, which, by the way, when we talk about tactical nuclear weapons, the size of these weapons is equivalent to what was dropped on Japan to end World War II.
President Vladimir Putin has claimed Russia is ready to use nuclear weapons if there's a threat to statehood, sovereignty or independence. In a rambling interview with Russian state TV, Mr. Putin said he hoped the US would refrain from actions that could trigger a nuclear conflict. It's another blunt warning to the West ahead of a presidential vote this week in which he's all but certain to win another 6-year term in office. Andrew Webber is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical and Biological Defense Programs under President Obama. Good evening to you, Andrew.
Good evening.
What do you make of these latest threats from President Putin that Russia could turn to using nuclear weapons?
Well, it's reckless, but he's posturing. He has this sham election coming up in a couple of days, and so he's trying to show to his public that he's tough. But the truth is, they've lost over 300,000 casualties in the Ukraine war, which is a failed war. NATO has expanded. He's achieved none of his objectives. So all he has left is nuclear weapons.
It's not, of course, the first time that he's made threats to use nuclear weapons. But nonetheless, do you think that there is any realistic prospect that he could actually do that?
I think there is. The terrible paradox is that the more successful the Ukrainian military is on the ground, for example, hitting targets in Crimea and Donbas, which Putin considers part of Russia, the more likely he is to resort to nuclear weapons. This is a longstanding Russian nuclear doctrine they call it escalate to de-escalate, and it is possible. So we need to be prepared and take his threats very seriously.
Because, of course, Moscow has a huge nuclear arsenal, doesn't it?
They have an enormous arsenal, including over 2,000 so-called tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons. And these are the type that he's most likely to use in or near Ukraine, as opposed to his longer-range strategic weapons on ballistic missiles.
But surely that would put at risk Russian forces and Russians in that area as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, we've seen how much concern they have for the lives of their soldiers. There would be some blowback possibly into Russia of radiation, but he's a brutal dictator, and it's entirely up to him, to one man, his mood, and if he feels humiliated or if he feels that he's losing the war in Ukraine, he could indeed resort to these horrific weapons, which, by the way, when we talk about tactical nuclear weapons, the size of these weapons is equivalent to what was dropped on Japan to end World War II.
So, this would cause destruction over a huge area.
Absolutely. It would be devastating. Now, we should be prepared to save lives. We can reduce the casualties in half or less with prepositioning of burn dressings and approved drugs for acute radiation syndrome.
President Putin, in this long and rambling interview, also described Western leaders as vampires with a taste for human flesh. It was a quite extraordinary interview. What do you think that we should read into this?
Well, I think it's mostly posturing for his ahead of the election. He's trying to look composed and confident, but he's paranoid. the war is not going well. NATO has expanded. Sweden most recently joined NATO. Finland before that. So he's trying to, show to his public that he's the strong leader. But indeed, I believe he's not as strong as he wants people to think.
And we've seen these wave of attacks by Ukrainian drones on targets inside Russia. I mean, that's quite a bold move, isn't it, by the Ukrainian forces?
It's extraordinary, including in St. Petersburg, possibly. So, Ukraine says if you're going to hit targets in our country, we're going to hit targets in your country, and they have with their own munitions, not with ones that the United States or the UK has provided, but they have been very effectively hitting targets inside Russia, fuel depots, rail stations, to prevent the logistical resupply of Russian forces in occupied Ukraine.